Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the Pokrov section of the front line where the Russians have managed to capture the village of Lysychne. This is south of the Kaseny river line and east of Rodivka. This advance after the Russians have secured the Russian control over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians north of Ivanivka, and the Russians will likely push on to Svirodovivka, which is now vulnerable following the Russian capture of the fortified positions east and south of it. This will lead to the Russian control over the crossing here over the Kaseny Turets River. The Russians will then use that opportunity to move on to Novotoretsk and flank the Ukrainian fortified positions of Ivanivka from the north, where the Russians will then move on through Ivanivka towards the northeastern flank of Rodivka, where the Russians will look to align the front line with the Kaseny Turets river line to the north and the forest lines here to the south, establishing positions in the northeastern parts and flanking Rodivka from the north. We already see that the Russians are advancing towards Rodivka from the southeast, and if they manage to gain control of the fortified positions here as well, they will have a wide front against Rodivka. The Russians are continuously pushing here to the southwest as well, where with the capture of Serhivka and Vesele, the Russian forces are now fighting over the fortified positions south of Rodivka, flanking the southern flank as well. The Russian offensive operations here in the Pokrov section of the front line continue. In the New York section, the Ukrainians have managed to recapture the educational area and much of the northern part of the Turets River here in the New York section of the front line. So with this, the Ukrainians are now re-establishing positions in the north, re-establishing the connection to the road here to the west, and securing the northern flank of New York. The recapture of these positions allowed the Ukrainians to better hold on to their positions in New York and buy enough time for the Ukrainian forces in the east to avoid encirclement by withdrawing if it is needed. Otherwise, they'll be able to allow the Ukrainians to spread out their forces, redirect their forces, and send in reinforcements to hold the line and slow down the Russians even further. The Ukrainian recapture of the positions here northwest of New York was confirmed with this geolocated footage posted by Deep State Map, which shows a Ukrainian flag being hoisted in the educational building following the Russian hoisting of their flag in that same building just a few days ago. Moving on to the Kursk offensive of the Ukrainians, they have continued pushing here in the central parts where they have expanded the front line a bit further and deeper into Russian territory. However, they have not managed to capture much more than they already held. On the first 2 days of the Ukrainian Kursk offensive, they managed to capture 310 square kilometers of territory. Today, they have only managed to capture 13 square kilometers, putting it up to 323 square kilometers under Ukrainian control of the Kursk region. The Ukrainians are here moving along the Russian fortified line connected to Sucha in the south, all the way to Luknia in the north, and they're also attempting to flank Luknia from the north towards Nikolsky and Viktorovka along the road here. The Ukrainian objective here is twofold. They are trying to hold on to the current positions and dig in, which they have started to do. They're starting to dig in fortified positions, and taking control of the fortified positions of the Russians, which are already available, will allow the Ukrainians to have a first line of defense, and then they'll create additional lines of defense beyond that. And at the same time, they want to avoid the Russians from counterattacking further. The Ukrainian objective has now turned completely defensive, and this follows this attack by the Ukrainians, where they were attacking both in the direction of Korenevo and in the northern direction as well, flanking Luknia and the surrounding villages along the river line, where they were trying to go deeper into Russian territory through the north. However, these attacks failed as the Russian army had now rotated to these positions. This led the Russians to ambush the Ukrainian forces and prevent them from pushing further. The Ukrainians, following that, now switch completely to the defensive positions, where they're trying to hold on to the frontline villages, the fortified positions, and gain full control over them to then allow them to hold a strong position there. They are also at the same time, as earlier said, digging in. This allows the Ukrainians to have a strong defensive capability in the Kursk side of the border area, and this just clears up the objective completely. There's no doubt in my mind that the Ukrainian objective was to preempt the Russian Sumy offensive, and now they are trying to do a reverse of the Kharkiv offensive, where they are trying to hold on to their positions and turn onto the defensive, exactly as the Russians have done in the Kharkiv region, where they're going to be focusing on the defense and not attempting to advance much further. They'll try to gain and further positions that will improve their current defensive posture. However, there will be no big offensive further, where they'll try to gain more territory. This image here shows all of the geolocated footages of the Ukrainian advances within the Kursk region. We see that it is focused on the northern parts, where the Ukrainians have managed to advance and capture several positions, and this is where the Ukrainians went the deepest. Then there's the positions near Sudzha, where the Ukrainians were geolocated at the outskirts of it. There's been no geolocation of the full control of it. However, it was reported by Russian sources that they had lost the western parts of Sudzha and the eastern parts remained under their control, where the current Russian defensive positions are along the river line that goes through the central parts in between Sudzha, the western parts and eastern parts. And then their second line of defense would be the railways. However, it is unlikely that the Ukrainians will cross over the river. They will instead use the river line as their defensive positions to prevent the Russians from making full use of the heights further behind Sudzha, and to prevent from using too many units on the offensive operations when they can now dig in and turn to the defensive. A big mistake in this idea is that the Russians are now in their own territory. This means that the Ukrainians have a very difficult time dealing with the Russian Air Force, as the Ukrainians simply do not have enough air defense close enough to the border area to hit Russian jets flying far away from the front line, launching the FAB bombs, for example, and the Russians will be able to use airfields that are far enough to not be struck by any of the Ukrainian weapons. This means that the Russian Air Force will be much more safe and effective in the Russian side of the border than the Ukrainian side, where they would have to go deeper and closer to the Ukrainian air defense. The Russian counter-operation will likely start soon, where they will look to regain full control over the borderline, and at the same time they will go deeper and start an attack into the Sumy region. This has pretty much been confirmed by all of the Russian sources, both the Russian soldiers and other sources, claiming that it was already the Russian plan to do so prior to the Ukrainian offensive, and the offensive has not changed. This was also said by Gerasimov himself. He said they're going to kick out the Ukrainians and then they're going to go beyond that. So this shows that the Russians are planning not just to kick out the Ukrainians, but also to enter Ukrainian territory in the Sumy region. With this, we see that the Russians have gathered a lot of troops in this section of the front line. They're already planning this offensive, therefore their troops were already nearby, and a large concentration of these troops will now be moving to that direction. Most of the units fighting here in the Kursk region on the Russian side are of the Sever group, which is the northern group, the one where the Russians are already fighting in the Kharkiv region. So they are part of these troops that entered the Kharkiv region, and they were preparing to enter the Sumy region. At the same time, there are reports that Wagner will also be joining, that there are some troops from the Akhmet Special Forces, not to be confused with the Chechen ones, have already been transferred, and they're sent to battle near Sudzha. There's also the Ratibor group, which is confirmed to be sent and deployed to the Kursk region. At the same time, we see additional units throughout the different parts. There's also FSB units involved in this fighting. The Russians are not involving the conscripts, only the ones that were operating as border guards, which were caught by surprise with the Ukrainian attack, were involved in the fighting. No other conscripts have been deployed to fight. The Russians have hundreds of thousands of conscripts, yet they're not making any use of them despite the Ukrainians entering the Kursk region, because these soldiers simply do not have enough training yet. However, it is likely, based on these current developments, that the Russians will be more motivated to fight in the conflict, especially conscripts who had friends who were involved in this fight, either be taken prisoner or killed in this battle. They are likely to be more motivated to fight the Ukrainians and sign a contract into the Russian army following this development. Although that it is a good offensive, well-executed tactical offensive by the Ukrainians, the strategic goals of this offensive is much more debatable and questionable. The fact that the Ukrainians are using the reserves that they've been building for a long time for this operation is really just absurd, especially since they have been prioritizing weapons and equipment for these soldiers and have been giving them a lot of training to use this weapon properly and to fight properly, that they're using them on such an operation which has really no strategic sense or objective. However, we are still in the initial stages of the fighting, therefore it is not clear how this situation will develop further in the future. We just have to take a look out for what developments happen, and I'll make sure to come out with timely updates with the newest developments. That's going to be all for this one. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.